So somebody asked me, do men and women grieve differently? And the answer is that oftentimes they do. Women often grieve with a lot of emotion. They're very open in their emotions. We talk a lot. We may cry a lot. We may be openly grieving. We feel our feelings very strongly and are quite driven by them. Men, on the other hand, often feel after a death quite responsible, and they often feel they want to get back to work quickly, back to normal life, and they may find that they shut down their emotions quite a bit. Not necessarily, but maybe. And they also very often feel that if somebody in their wife's family has died, for example, that they need to be the strong one for the children, for their wife. They need to hold it together. And they're very driven to get life back to normal. So you can see that you've got two polarities. You've got all the emotions going on over here with the women, and the men very often are trying really hard to contain their grief and contain themselves and get back to normal. What actually needs to happen is that the men need a bit more of what the women are doing, and the women need a bit more of what the men are doing, so that it's a little bit more balanced. Because I think that very often women will judge their male partner as being perhaps unemotional or cold, or judge they're not grieving enough, and the men judge the women as being way too tearful, and they can't cope with all this emotion all day, and it's too much and it's too overwhelming. So there needs to be a balance. So the women really could do with trying to find a way back into their life, and perhaps find a way to set aside times for grieving, or try and not allow it to consume their whole day. And men perhaps to open their hearts a little bit and even be able to verbalize their grief, or cry if they want to. They don't have to. And so they step towards each other, so that there is more balance for women and more balance for men, and they're not polarized in either camp. I think it's really important to say no one is right and no one is wrong. It's not helpful to judge the other person, whichever sex it is, in their grief. They are just doing their grief in the way that feels right to them, and they may also feel they don't have any control over it. That's very, very understandable. I think what really helps is if both men and women in a household where there is a lot of grief can just step back for a moment and look at what's going on. Can they actually observe what is happening in the house? It's quite helpful to go to counselling, because I think counsellors probably recognise it before people who are just alone in the house, if you see what I mean. So going to counselling can be useful to try and paint a picture of what's going on. But once people understand the way they're behaving, it is actually easier to make some changes and to understand each other better. There is always this complication within a grieving household that people tiptoe around each other. Oh, I don't want to upset them. I don't want to make them cry. I'm going to do everything I can not to let that happen. I don't want things to be worse. What I would say about that to both men and women is, can it get any worse? You know, in a sense, you are at the worst point of time at this moment. And if you can open up the lines of communication towards each other and open your hearts with understanding, I think it really helps. So it's really simple, but actually talking really helps. Having time to express how you're both feeling and meeting each other in that place, even though you might be doing it completely differently. We think, you know, when we think about grieving families, you know, we think everybody's going to pull together and it's all going to be a united front and everybody's going to grieve at the same time and cry at the same time and everybody's going to understand everybody else. But really that's a Hollywood version of it. It doesn't really happen like that. So I do recognise, and I hope you can recognise, that it is a period of time that is very difficult for families, but communication is definitely the way through. So what's to be done? Speak to your partner, your children, and your family members, and keep these lines of communication open. Try not to shut down and isolate yourself, because that's when grief becomes more fixed and insular, and that doesn't help your family support you or you to support other family members. And remember, I often think that short chats or talks together work better than imagining it has to be a really long-winded event. And that is especially true for children, because they are in their grief and out of their grief very, very quickly. So one of my tips would be to talk in the car, because nobody can get out, the doors are shut and you're going at speed, and it's a good chance to open up a short conversation and try and suss out how everybody's feeling. As I said, you know, you could think about individual counselling support. It's really helpful. And as a grief counsellor myself, and having had grief counselling myself several times, what I would say about it is having that 1 hour a week to download and get out everything you're feeling, even if that's just words, just tears, whatever it is like having a holding place that can support you for the rest of your week to go out and do what you need to do for your partner and family. And you always know that hour is coming the next week, so you know that you're going to have that space and time to be authentic with your grief. And lastly, to recognise that there are always going to be difficult times in grief. There's no way around it. I wish it was different, but it isn't. But try not to fret about that, because it's going to be okay. This is going to pass, and you are going to come through this. And even if you're grieving differently and you can't meet each other in your grief, it is still going to be okay in the longer term.